In addition to the Iliad and the Odyssey, a series of epics, collectively known as the epic cycle, records the story of the Trojan War. Whether or not this occurred, and whether or not the Iliad can or even should be considered to be historically accurate to any meaningful degree, is a question that's been debated for a very long time. Regardless of whether the Trojan War as described in the Iliad happened, or even if the Trojan War should be considered as being a real event that the Iliad preserves a portion of, we do know that something was going on in the Late Bronze Age in the Aegean Sea and the general area surrounding it. We have a series of Hittite texts recording warfare in the general region around the city they call Wilusa, otherwise usually known as Ilios or Troy, and generally associated with the archaeological site of Hisarlik, although there are a minority of scholars who argue that that site is not actually Troy, and that digging has been going on in the wrong spot. So what I want to do in this video, then, is explore the Hittite evidence and the military activity they describe, which could possibly be the real-life basis for the Trojan War as recorded in Greek epic poetry. Because this video is largely a discussion of source material and not some sort of a linear narrative, what I'm planning on doing is more of a video essay where I'm reading the script but throw in plenty of maps, historical artwork, things like that, so you may potentially find it more useful to listen to this one rather than strictly watching it. So, central to all of this is a land that the Hittite texts call Ahiawa, and dealing with the location of Ahiawa essentially poses the same problem that we have with the site of Hisarlik and its identity as the city of Troy. Essentially, all of these Bronze Age cities had central archives. It's part of why we know that the Hittite capital, Hattusha, is actually Hattusha, and not some other city that we've discovered. We have not, however, located the central archive at Hisarlik that would positively identify it as Troy, or Wilusa, as the Hittites knew it. There is an argument to be made, and it's one that needs to be taken seriously, that this is not in fact Troy. But the counter-argument to that is that the original archaeologist employed explosives, so the archive is probably blown up and is resting in the backdirt from the initial excavations. If you do not accept Hisarlik as Troy, in large part because we don't have definitive evidence saying that it was Troy, then, unfortunately, there is nothing else in the region where the Hittites said that this city was that would be large enough to warrant a different identification. At least, nothing that has been substantially excavated thus far, with one exception I'm going to explore in an upcoming video. So, the majority of Bronze Age specialists have equated the two, because it makes the most sense in light of the evidence. It is the only major site in the region. We have approximately 24 or so Hittite texts which discuss Ahiawa. It's someplace to the west of the Hittites, and it has not been firmly identified beyond all doubt. It was first proposed in the early 20th century that this land should be identified with Greece, with the Hittite Ahiawa being the word that they used to describe the people that Homer called Achaeans in the Iliad. Essentially, that Ahiawa was the Hittite rendering of the Greek term. That idea was challenged in the 1930s, but the challenge is not really taken all that seriously, much for the same reason that specialists on the Bronze Age largely accept the site of Hisarlik as the historical city of Wilusa, or Troy. Basically, the Hittites are continually describing some sort of extensive region inhabited by many people, living in cities, villages, and fortresses, often coming together either in some sort of confederation or having some sort of a high king, and Bronze Age Greece is the only thing in the area that seems to fit the bill. If you do not accept that, then Hittite documents are describing what would appear to be a large archaeological culture that we have not been able to locate despite the massive amount of work done since the 19th century, which strongly suggests that the Ahiawans are the Greeks. If that identification is correct, what that then means is that we have about 24 texts describing Greeks fighting somewhere on the Anatolian coast between the dates given in those texts, approximately the 15th through the 12th centuries BC. All of that, however, is the comparatively easy stuff. The more difficult aspects of this come when attempting to figure out the political events these texts are describing, which is some sort of a rebellion in a region known as Asua in the 15th century, and this is where we begin to come to the Trojan War, or at least maybe something that may have inspired it. The truth behind the legend, if you will. We have 6 Hittite documents which mention a rebellion in Asua. likely located in the northwest of Anatolia, conducted by a coalition of 22 cities during the time of the Hittite king Tudalia. It's not certain if Tudalia is one or two people, so what you'll generally see is this person or persons referred to as Tudalia I/II, but generally, the reign dates between about 1450 BC and about 1420 BC. That much we do definitely know for certain. A document dating to the reign of Arnuwanda, who ruled after Tudalia, references a conflict during the reign of Tudalia during which a group of people, led by a man named Atarasiya, the ruler of Ahia, generally taken to be Ahiawa, that is, the Greeks, came to Asua and fought Hittite troops. This document also tells us that a Hittite officer, Kisnapili, was sent against the Ahiawans and he led a force of 100 chariots and several thousand infantry against them. There appears to be a brief period of peace during which Tudalia led different campaigns against regions in southwestern Anatolia, known as Arzawa, Hapala, and the Seha Riverland. It is during those campaigns that the 6 documents state that the Confederacy in Asua rebelled against Tudalia, and those same texts state very clearly that one of these cities, probably the leader of the coalition, was Wilusa, or Troy. So what we appear to have here is a record of some sort of Ahiawan military campaign in Asua, which was possibly defeated, and then there is a rebellion in the region against Hittite rule a few years later. This rebellion was evidently defeated, and the Asuan king, Piyama Kurunta, his son Kukuli, the rest of the royal family of Asua, 1,200 horses, 600 chariots, 10,000 soldiers, all of their armor, all of their weapons, and a significant portion of the Asuan population, were forcibly removed from the region and taken back to the Hittite capital of Hattusa. We do not know the exact timeline here, but we do know 2 things for a fact. Firstly, Kukuli, the son of Piyama Kurunta, was made king of the region of Asua and he ruled as a Hittite vassal. And secondly, Kukuli rebelled, and like the first rebellion, this one was crushed very violently. Kukuli was executed and the Confederacy of the 22 cities was effectively destroyed. What complicates all of this is the presence of a sword, discovered in Hattusa with writing on the blade that reads, "As Tudalia, the great king, shattered the Asua country, he dedicated these swords to the storm god, his lord." It is not certain how many of these weapons there would have been, but evidently it was at least a few, because the writing says swords, in the plural, not the singular. We do know that the Ahiawans had conducted some sort of a military expedition early in the reign of Tudalia before the Asuan cities rebelled the first time. But, during the second rebellion, it would appear that the Asuans either had weapons supplied to them, or possibly even had direct military support from Greece, if that is indeed where Ahiawa was, because the sword discovered at Hattusa is a Greek weapon. We know from other Hittite documents that the city of Wilusa survived the rebellion, and while perhaps not exactly prospering, it did continue to be a regional player for the next 2 centuries. We also know that Hittite texts continually reference the Ahiawans over those 2 centuries, which is why most specialists connect the Ahiawans to the Greeks. It's the only power in the region that makes sense in the context of what the documents tell us. Of all the surviving documents which mention Ahiawa, Wilusa, and the relationship between them, the most intriguing one is a 13th century document which alludes to a marriage alliance between the 2 regions. A Hittite text, which is a translation of a letter sent by the king of Ahiawa to the king of the Hittites, Muwatalli II, who ruled between 1295 and 1272, references Tudalia and the Asua rebellion, which had happened over 100 years ago by this time. So, if Wilusa is identified with Troy in the region of Asua, and Ahiawa is identified with Greece, which is what seems to make the most sense, what's being described in this document is the following. We do not have direct evidence of the Greeks engaging in military conflict with the Hittites during the first or second Asuan rebellions, at least according to Hittite documents, despite apparent earlier military activity on the Anatolian coast. But we do have evidence of some sort of a marriage alliance in the 15th century between Asua and Ahiawa, because this 13th century document is informing the Hittite king, Muwatalli II, that a group of islands was given to the king of Ahiawa at the time of the Asuan rebellion as part of a dowry that the Asuan princess brought to the marriage between the 2 parties. When the Assyrian rebellion was defeated, the islands were seized by the Hittites, and now, about 150 years later, the king of Ahiyawa wants his property back. This would, maybe, explain the presence of the sword found at Hattusa. If there was an alliance of some kind between Ahiyawa and the Assyrian Confederacy, then material support certainly could have been something that the Ahiyawans could have supplied. The documents pick up again during the 13th century, which is closer to when the Trojan War was supposed to have occurred, according to traditional dates given by the Greeks and then later by the Romans. One, admittedly very damaged document dating to the early 13th century, mentions a Hittite attack on Wilusa. That is all we know. There was an attack, we don't know why or for how long this happened. The other, much more substantial document dealing with either this incident or one that happened very shortly after, is known as the Alexander Treaty. This text outlines a defensive alliance, which appears to view the whole relationship between the Hittite king, Muwatalli, and the king of Wilusa, Alexander, as one of lord and vassal, and is generally dated to about 1280 BC. The document tells us that Muwatalli is Alexander's lord, and that he has come to his vassal's defense before this treaty was signed, that is, before about 1280 BC, and he defeated the enemies of Alexander. We do not know who these enemies were, and as far as Alexander is concerned, the text records him pledging both himself and his family in loyalty to the Hittites, basically forever. This is very clearly an alliance that is designed to last. But at the same time, the chronology concerning that first document, recording a Hittite attack on Wilusa, leaves this open to doubt because we don't know where it fits in. All we know is that sometime prior to about 1280, the Hittites apparently both attacked Wilusa and came to its defense, and that it happened in living memory during the reign of Muwatalli, and because he started his reign in 1295 BC, that means that all of this happened at some point probably over about 15 years. Following this, we have a document known as the Tawagalawa letter. The 6 documents dating to the time of King Tudalia, that is, the 15th century, explicitly describe military action taken by the Hittites against a force from Ahiyawa. The Tawagalawa letter is the next document we have which explicitly describes a conflict of some sort between these two parties, and it dates to sometime between about 1270 BC and about 1230 BC, so about 200 years later. Unfortunately, we don't have the full text. What we do have is apparently the 3rd tablet in a group that probably was 3 in total. In other words, we have the ending of the message. This was sent by the Hittite king, probably Hattusili III, but possibly Muwatalli II, who ruled before him, to the king of Ahiyawa, whose name we do not know, and this letter references 2 people, Piyamaradu, who is described as a Hittite rebel, and Tawagalawa, the brother of the Ahiyawan king, who was in Anatolia at the time, and who was transporting Hittite rebels to territory controlled by Ahiyawa. The letter is evidently a plea by the Hittite king, or at least what looks like a plea, for the king of Ahiyawa to communicate to the king of Wilusa, commonly understood to be Troy, to stop fighting the Hittites because the Hittites and the Ahiyawans have made peace over the matter. Piyamaradu was evidently around a bit later as well, because he shows up in the last Hittite reference we have to any sort of a conflict, dated to sometime during the reign of the Hittite king Tudalia IV, that is 1237 to 1209 BC. This particular text is known as the Milawata letter because it's primarily concerned with the city of Milawata. The relevant portion for the overall topic of this video, however, tells us that Piyamaradu was a warlord but appears to be referenced as a past figure. In the present, again sometime between 1237 and about 1209 BC, apparently the treaty that the Hittites signed with Alexander was still in force, and a man named Walmu, who was king of Wilusa, had been driven from his city and territory by a group of attackers, the identity of whom we do not currently know. And, as of right now, that is where the documentary evidence ends. So does any of this then connect to the Trojan War as recorded in epic poems like the Iliad, the Odyssey, or later the Roman Aeneid? That is fairly difficult to say. In the Odyssey, there is a scene where Odysseus goes to Hades, and while there, he speaks with Achilles, and a group of people known as the Chettians are mentioned, as well as a man named Telephos. They are, tentatively, identified with the Hittites and Telepinu, a Hittite royal name, respectively. All knowledge of the Hittites appears to have been essentially lost by the Greco-Roman period, so if this is indeed a reference to the Hittites in Greek epics, it's just one line. Despite that, something was very clearly going on in Anatolia in the Late Bronze Age. The single most important thing to note, I think, is that unlike other periods of history where the source evidence is so limited that you could, in theory, read everything for a given era, this is not necessarily the case with the Hittites. There are many Hittite texts that have not yet been translated sitting in archives at museums and universities, so it's entirely possible that the state of our knowledge on this matter could change. It would seem, however, that the sources as we know them right now detail 4 conflicts that involve the Hittites, the city of Troy, and the Ahiawans, again probably to be identified with the Greeks. There have been tentative suggestions that maybe the Pia Maradu in Hittite documents is Priam in the Iliad, and Alexander is Paris, but that's really still up in the air. You could accept it just as easily as you could dismiss it. It's speculated as well that perhaps the Ahiawans attacked Troy and drove Walmu from the city, leading him to ask the Hittites for military aid. What we do know from these Hittite documents is that Troy or Wilusa was evidently a powerful city, and it was at the head of a coalition which caused some headaches for the Hittites. If the site of Hisarlik is indeed to be identified with Troy, then that should really come as no surprise given its location. It could very easily have exerted political, military, and economic power, especially over something like shipping. Of course, a lot of this is, given the state of the evidence, highly informed speculation. We do know that something was going on, and it's possible that the Ahiawans should not in fact be identified with the Greeks. If that's the case, though, then it would seem that we have a series of conflicts and we don't know the location of one of the major parties. If we accept that the Ahiawans are the Greeks, then we potentially have evidence for a series of struggles either over control of Troy, or at least involving the city, which would then lay the basis for a real Trojan War, regardless of what the Iliad itself says.